welcome to Slavery and Its Legacies, a podcast of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Slavery and Its Legacies interviews visiting scholars, activists, and others about their contributions to the understanding of slavery, past and present, and its ongoing role in the development of the modern world.
Hi, this is Tom Thurston, and today I'm talking with Amanda Kleintop, who is visiting fellow for the spring of 2020, and right now we're talking remotely because of the plague. And you're in North Adams or near North Adams, Massachusetts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, North Adams, Mass.
Fantastic. Amanda is an assistant professor of history at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, which is in North Adams. She received her PhD from Northwestern University, and her dissertation was The Balance of Freedom, Abolishing Property Rights and Slaves After the U.S. Civil War. And I also, I have to add that you did your undergraduate work at the University of Richmond, and you co-edited a very important book with James Horton. Jim Horton is a wonderful guy, passed away a few years now. It's called The Tough Stuff of American History and Memory. How did that, first of all, I'm curious, how did that come to happen?
Right, well, in some ways I was very lucky. I was asked if I would be interested in an internship with the Virginia Sesquicentennial of the American Civil War Commission, which in short is the state of Virginia's commission for the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. So that was, I think they ran really from 2010-ish until 2015.
Yeah.
They started a little bit before, and one of my mentors in undergrad at Ayers had been very involved in the very first conference and events that they put on commemorating the coming of the Civil War. And so, Richmond had that connection, and I had already been shown a lot of interest and done a lot of work on the Civil War and emancipation in undergrad. So I took on an internship, and really the moment that I took on that internship, that commission was running a public conference on slavery and the Civil War, right? The tough stuff of American history, which I think was also partly inspired by Jim Horton and Lois Horton's book, which is, I think, the same title.
Right.
Or like Slavery in American Memory.
Very similar, right?
Yeah. So really, I was lucky in that I didn't plan any of that conference. All of the credit for that goes to Dr. Horton and the folks at the commission. And I stepped in and helped out with the conference as it was happening. I was also running the commission's Facebook page and social media, which actually was very eye-opening because we had a lot of neo-Confederate.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. There were a lot of there were some legal teams involved with the state trying to figure out, like, are we allowed to delete people's comments that are overtly racist, or is that a First Amendment violation? Turned out, yes, it would have been. Wow. So we deleted all comments. But on the kind of plus side, during the conference, I helped run the Q&A from the public. And then after the conference, helped edit this book to essentially make sure that people who weren't at the conference could continue to interact with it. The commission really saw those books because there was a conference every year for the sesquicentennial along a different theme. And those books, I think, the commission viewed as a kind of permanent way of enshrining what had been communicated and learned at those conferences. So that was really the approach that we took to the book. And I was still a senior in college when that was all happening. So
amazing.
Yeah, it really was. And that really kind of just probably set the stage for what I would do for the rest of my career as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Now, your dissertation and your time at the center has been spent on kind of working that dissertation into your book. It's really kind of about all the debates over the idea of compensated emancipation. So, is that something when did that spark your interest?
And honestly, that was really one of those things that like boils down to a conversation with my PhD advisor, Kate Mazur. I had been interested in the Civil War and emancipation, obviously, for a very long time. But really, what I had wanted to work on was a history of the slave trade during the Civil War. And that had been very much inspired by my time in Richmond as well. Because those sites of the slave trade were really contested spaces in the city's politics. And I think they still are, to my knowledge. They've made a lot of, activists have made a lot of interesting kind of progress in that regard, though, since I've left. But, I should also add that I know that I did not end up picking up this project, but another Civil War scholar and recent PhD, Robert Colby, has.
Right.
So if anyone's interested.
I was just introduced to him on Twitter, but
but I ended up kind of deviating from that simply because I was just sitting in my office with Kate, I was sitting in Kate's office with her, and we were just talking about like my projects, what I would pursue for the PhD, and we were both just like, wait a second, if people were buying and selling enslaved people up through 1865, what did they think was going to happen?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's an amazing question.
Yeah. So, that's fine. I appreciate it. So I went back into like secondary sources, really, first and foremost, and I came back with like, well, all these historians say that no one wanted compensation for the value of slaves. And then I just looked at their citations, and a lot of them were federal sources that have since been published online. And then I looked at those federal sources, and like right there is someone saying there's a widespread expectation among white Southerners that they'll get compensation for slaves. And I'm just like, wait, what? So that's really where the project came from, was just like this question of not only what did former slave owners, white Southerners expect, but also like why did so many historians, especially in the early 1900s, say that they didn't expect this.
Yeah, and that's there was a cover-up. There was a cover-up,
Right?
And it is amazing that it in some ways really hadn't been addressed. Going all the way back to the Dunning School, no one had really challenged that. And I was very impressed in the way that going back to the sources that are cited in that work, right on the same page, there's, as you say, comments about it. Now I assume, well, you tell me what was the logic of Dunning et al. To kind of downplay debates over compensation?
Right. So these guys, and I don't know how broad of an audience your listeners are, but these are historians who really made a mission out of kind of explaining the Jim Crow South as it was, as they were living in it in the early 1900s. So their job then in their minds is to show that white supremacy was correct and like the best political outcome that the South could have had from the Civil War and Reconstruction. So one of the big statements that they made about the Civil War in particular was that slavery did not cause the Civil War, right? We're all kind of familiar with that battle, I think. And their idea there was that slavery was a unprofitable economic institution that would have died out, right, if the Civil War had not itself killed it. So the whole idea that white Southerners didn't want compensation really plays into that idea, because if slavery was so unprofitable, like why would they have needed compensation in the first place, right? And so they're really trying to downplay that economic significance of slavery to the white South, to America as a whole, and and they're not going to include those claims for compensation during Reconstruction, particularly because one of their other main tenets is that the white South just accepted emancipation with the end of the war and Confederate defeat.
Right.
So a lot of my work is just showing no.
Yeah, and for good reason they contested this. I mean, the idea that they should be compensated. It's a huge. I mean, the Fifth Amendment? It's a huge taking of property. You could argue, right? Which is what they did, and that, in fact, and maybe you can go into it more, but that kind of explains how, in fact, it isn't a dying institution, the institution of slavery, that it's doing pretty well in the eve of the Civil War.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting things about the Fifth Amendment debate is that this debate over whether or not slave owners had a Fifth Amendment right to property in humans, right? As opposed to any other form of property, was really a question that was at the heart of the abolitionist movement and the debates that led to the Civil War in the first place.
Sure.
White Southerners are insisting that enslaved people are property like any other kind of property, whereas abolitionists and many anti-slavery politicians are saying, no. Property in humans it's very different. And of course, they're also insisting that there cannot be such a thing as property in humans. That's a violation of enslaved people's natural rights. Right. So that's a lot of where that debate, or how that debate is shaping in the antebellum era. And after the Civil War, you really see that being rehashed in these debates about the Fifth Amendment, because that it hadn't really been tested, although the Dred Scott decision kind of addressed it, right? That decision does say that enslaved people were property under the law, but the Civil War itself became the test of this specific Fifth Amendment debate.
Right, although it's a little complicated because, in fact, DC enslavers received compensated emancipation. How did that kind of, I mean, there you have, this has already happened. How does that kind of enter into the debate? And maybe, again, for listeners, just say a little about the kind of political rationale for compensated emancipation for DC.
So for some politicians, the Fifth Amendment was a large part of it. That's definitely some of it behind the rhetoric. On the other hand, though, you have folks like Sumner saying this is a ransom, right? This is compensation for DC slave owners is not compensation, it's a ransom for humans, which, right, because he's playing up that abolitionist argument of there's no such thing as property in humans. And, I think you can also look at a lot of what is happening in conversations about compensation to not just DC slave owners, but also slave owners in those border states that remained in the Union and still had slavery. Folks really emphasize that the federal government is trying to maintain the loyalty of slave owners so that, for the war effort. I think there's also, and this is something that I'm kind of hesitant to talk about because I'm thinking it through right now, but I also think there is a degree to which federal policymakers are trying to express these compensations to slave owners in DC, in border states, not as a property argument, right? They're not saying that they are compensating slave owners for the Fifth Amendment. They're saying that they are compensating slave owners for the labor those enslaved people that they are missing out on, right? So they're making this little twisty argument so that they're not making any kind of precedent.
Right, and they're kind of it seems like they're taking little baby steps forward too, because up until the Emancipation Proclamation, the Provisional Proclamation kind of gives a nod to compensation, and of course even the Emancipation Proclamation says nothing about the issue of slavery in the states that were loyal to the Union. So so that, I mean, I guess then if we're going to move forward in that sort of thing, is that then with the 13th Amendment and slavery is abolished, it would seem that would be the time to say, oh yeah, and you're not getting compensated for it. But that doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah, that doesn't happen. And I think that's largely because there might be a few reasons. And this is also a question that I'm working on in these revisions as I'm at the GLC. I think that one, you know, the folks writing the 13th Amendment are the same kinds of, are thinking the same way that Sumner is, right? They're thinking there's not property in humans anymore. The war is over. But those congressmen in the border states, like Kentucky, for example, they're making those arguments about the Fifth Amendment, even during the debates on the 13th Amendment. They're saying, no, you must compensate slave owners, especially in the border states. Although what happens after the war, right, becomes, which is where the bulk of my dissertation and my research lies, is in how, like, I just don't think that a lot of folks were thinking at that time that former slave owners in the South would come back and say, we must have compensation after they were defeated, right? Like and then that does happen and they're like, whoa, hold on a second. And it also, I think, speaks to just, yes, we're talking about economics, right? We're talking, indeed, like, slavery was a very important and valuable part of the US economy, but especially after the war, a lot of this fight is just a fight over political control. So so former slave owners, white Southerners, and Southern politicians are saying we should have compensation as a part of a Reconstruction plan, believing that they might be able to push that through once their representatives are readmitted into Congress. And when they don't, and when they don't, they're going to debate that, and Congress is going to include that in the 14th Amendment as well, instead of the 13th Amendment.
Right. So the kind of pushback has been happening, and so say a little about Section 4, I guess. I wouldn't have known that otherwise, except for here. Well, it's not the section that rings in everyone's ears when we talk about those things.
When I present my research to lawyers or JTs, I usually start off with an introduction. Like, when you think of the 14th Amendment, we all think of like sections 1 and 2, like particularly like and how foundational they are to like civil rights in the US. And then I'm like, wait, what about this random little clause right here? Seemingly random. And honestly, that section is really what kind of confirmed that my research would be about compensation for former slave owners, because again, like, if they didn't want it, then why is it in the Constitution that they wouldn't get it? So essentially that section of the 14th Amendment comes out of those early post-war politics, right? Where so white Southerners had gone back to the drawing board with their state constitutions as mandated by Andrew Johnson in 1865, excuse me. And what I found in those constitutional conventions and in politics was that they usually accepted the 13th Amendment, largely because they had to. And their plan was, okay, once we accept the 13th Amendment, once we rewrite the state constitution, then we can re-enter Congress and petition for compensation. So they kind of temporarily or accepted emancipation, or they accepted it with reservations, right? And so Congress is watching all of that go down, and when Congress reconvenes in December of 1865, right around when the 13th Amendment is actually ratified and put into power, really, or put into play, Congress just decides it will not accept the former Confederate states' congressional representatives that had been elected after they rewrote those state constitutions. So this is a really huge moment in U.S. history for a few reasons, right? I mean, that's it's a really bold statement. Like it's hard for me to even imagine that happening today. Like Congress saying no to a state, no, you don't get representation. And also what it does is Congress essentially takes control of Reconstruction, or at least it sends a very broad message it's going to be taking control of Reconstruction. And one of those first steps is in just figuring out like what's playing out on the ground in the South. So Congress creates the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, led by Thaddeus Stevens, and they do a bunch of different interviews and hearings with folks in the South, and really a large representation of people, like people who are in the military, newspaper reporters, Black Southerners, white Southerners, and they do asks a few directly, like, what about this stuff? What about compensation? And most of those people that they asked directly about compensation said, oh yeah, the South does, the white South does expect this. So it made its way into the Joint Committee's draft of what became the 14th Amendment. And there's not a lot of documentation actually of that process of like how things, of how the committee came up with that draft, unfortunately. But we do have the congressional debates about it. And yeah, that fourth section essentially not only compensates former slave owners, but also would force former Confederate states to repudiate their state debts, which essentially was all of the money that was used to pay for the Confederate war effort, right? So what's really interesting to me too about this section is that both of those kind of commitments they're kind of economic, but they're also very, very charged, like ideologically charged economic kind of policies, if you will, that are really saying the US is not going to pay for the value of any person who was enslaved, and it's not going to pay for the Confederate war effort. So some people in Congress really thought that this was a punishment, right? But most people were totally okay with that at this moment in time, because they're having these debates in early 1866. The war is really, really fresh in their minds. However, some of them are saying, wait, does this have to be permanent? Like, if this is a war, like if this is about the war, why is this in the Constitution? Why is this going to be enshrined in US history, essentially, for as long as this Constitution is here? And that question really, I was surprised to see that it really didn't, that question itself didn't get all that heavily debated. And I think that's largely because those border state congressmen come back and they repeat the same kinds of Fifth Amendment claims, ideas that they're being robbed of enslaved people. But at this point, they're not just talking about the border states. They're talking about the entire South. So they're really just playing right into those like animosities, those wartime animosities. And they really convince, I think, those congressmen who are like, wait, should this be permanent? Wait, is this really necessary right now that this section is going to be and should be in the 14th Amendment?
There's this back and forth over the issue of compensation throughout this period. Of course, there's something happening with formerly enslaved African Americans in the issue of compensation, and whether or not, through appropriating land or other means, that somehow they should be compensated for their labor and their parents' and grandparents' labor, for that matter. And conversation is even bumping up against the question of compensation. Does anyone even, like, a Northern abolitionist kind of fire back and say, say if we, should be talking about compensation, well, then let's talk about, black
Very few, actually,
man.
which was surprising to me, I think, as the as someone who is living today in the midst of like today's political debates about reparations, for example. So yeah, very few folks are actually making that connection, and I think that there's a variety of reasons why that is the case. One, even the people who are making that connection, they are abolitionists, maybe a few congressmen here or there. Usually when they're making that connection, they're how you interpret sources is always kind of in the eyes of the beholder, but in my mind often they're very sarcastic. It's very much like, it's kind of part of an argument of like, how would we even pay for that? Oh, and by the way, like, if we're talking about this for former slave owners, why aren't we talking about this for the formerly enslaved? And to me, it does very much feel like that, by the way.
Like it's a talking point, but it's nothing that like slave moving forward.
Right. And even in 1865 in particular, I've had very little luck finding Black Americans themselves talking about this issue. And I think there's a lot of reasons why. For one thing, they're occupied with lots of other important things, right? Like finding and reuniting families, trying to figure out like what free labor is going to look like, trying to get property and property rights, or like marriage rights and all of these things. Instead, where I have found some luck with Black Americans talking about this is a little more in like the 1870s and 1880s, actually, when this is becoming part of Reconstruction politics and even the end of Reconstruction, which I think is largely because those promises of Reconstruction aren't being realized. Right. So in 1865, there might have still been a chance for land redistribution and things like that. But by definitely the 1880s, it's very clear that that's not likely to happen, at least as a result of the war and emancipation.
Now, there's another party that enters into debate, and that's like financial institutions who are holding, enslavers hold, as far as they don't own, as property, these people outright. They're leveraged. They have anything else. They have like banks and insurance companies, a lot of kind of capital that's backing this. What is during the initial debate, what is like of say, and I don't know any institution per se, but what is the financial sector where they stand to lose or gain, around this question? How are they kind of entering in on this?
Yeah, so I think part of this is that that system is actually less formalized than we might imagine today. A lot of the, so as you expressed, a lot of slave owners actually buy and sell and mortgage enslaved people. They buy and sell enslaved people on credit, or they mortgage enslaved people. And a lot of times when they're doing that, they're actually buying from neighbors, family members. There are firms called factorage firms that also like put up money to buy or mortgage an enslaved person. But those are actually really largely more local transactions than they are like to a financial institution. So the debate that comes out after the war is one that's very much affected by the post-war context. Just simply that the South is very, very cash poor. And it's also important, it should be noted too, that the way that people tended to buy and sell enslaved people on credit was actually to have a slip of paper that essentially amounts to an IOU. It's a promissory note or a bond. So folks actually exchanged those notes as currency. And so you could, even if someone hadn't even bought an enslaved person, they could be holding the note for their value, right? Even if they hadn't participated in that initial transaction. So that's because these are actually so local and the Southern economy is so bad after the war, people are actually very, very worried about these debts. They're very concerned about the fact that they won't be getting any sort of compensation, and that might aggravate the really the contraction of the Southern economy. So those debates really end up in courtrooms. So far, the debates I've talked about are happening in these constitutional conventions, in legislatures and Congress, but these are really going into local state courtrooms. And that's even aggravated by the fact that, right, every former Confederate state has a new government like every few years. So that means that the courts are all like have to be rebuilt. So these things actually take a lot of time to figure out as you know, creditors and debtors are taking each other to court back and forth. And
is
you
it
do hear.
I'm sorry. How is it resolved?
Eventually, yeah. So by 1871, these cases, which are decided differently in Southern state courts, make their way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. For the most part, former Confederate states, the justices or their appellate courts are saying like when this enslaved person was purchased, this slavery was legal, and as long as the buyer, as long as the seller, you know, did his due diligence and gave the enslaved person over to the buyer, then the debt still stands.
So this is a valid contract, even though now it wouldn't be a valid. You couldn't, you know, purchase.
Right. Exactly. And the large majority of these former Confederate states appellate courts are saying that. However, one, notably New Louisiana, it does not say that. The justice in Louisiana makes some arguments that actually a few Black politicians in South Carolina will make as well, that these debts are essentially immoral, right? Like not only should they be illegal, but they are immoral. And so they really want to retroactively place the financial burden of emancipation on the buyer, right, and wipe out those debts altogether. They see a problem with having the value of enslaved people like floating around in the economy. On the flip side, though, if you think about it, if the courts did, as in Louisiana, they did say, okay, no, like these contracts are invalid and debtors no longer owe creditors, that just means that a different person who participated in like human trafficking gets off or gets let off, excuse me. So it's a really interesting moral question that does actually make it into the Congressional Reconstruction State Constitution Conventions between about 1867 and 1868. And so by the time this stuff reaches the US Supreme Court in 1871, the justices are really wading into what's a debate that's much more than a financial or a legal debate. Yeah. And they're really trying to avoid overcomplicating this, right? Some people are even saying, well, if there was no compensation for emancipation and those Fifth Amendment property rights were violated, then how can these contract rights still be valid? Right. And the court's like, oh no, we don't want to comment on the 14th Amendment. Like we don't want to comment on the validity of the 13th Amendment. So they really keep their they try to constrain this issue as much as possible to a contract law issue. And and say these debts are valid, which does mean that, yeah, debtors in theory have to pay back their creditors for the value of an enslaved person years after emancipation, many years, depending on where you date it. And the court also goes out of its way in the opinion to say that this decision has nothing to do with the rights of free people.
Yeah.
Which is an important point,
right.
But I think a lot of scholars are skeptical.
Right. Especially this is when the court is entering like its kind of heyday of like, contracts are,
yes.
Yeah. By God,
Right. And contracts, and I'm also going to say, like, it's really important to remember that context of the indebtedness of the South when talking about these debates, because, contracts for slave sales aren't the only contracts that are being debated at this moment in time. Really, almost every kind of debt and contract is under attack, simply because folks don't have the money to pay it back. And a lot of people think like this is the best way to restart the Southern economy, is to make sure that debtors don't need to be spending what little they have on their debts, but can rebuild. And yeah, like, and as you say, the court's like, no. There's the contract clause of the Constitution. Right.
Yeah. So how long does this struggle go on? Does it end like 1880s, or how does it conclude?
Yeah. Yeah. So currently writing this chapter, thanks to the GLC, and I'm honestly having a hard time pinpointing it. I think that I will go ahead and say that it ends with the Dunning School, right?
Right.
By the time the Dunning School comes along, the idea that white Southerners even wanted compensation is a total, like, no, as we discussed. However, these issues really keep recurring throughout the rest of the 19th century in ways that still kind of surprise me as I keep doing this research over the course of this fellowship. It comes up again, particularly in the 1872 presidential election between Horace Greeley and Grant, because Grant supporters basically accused Greeley of wanting to compensate former slave owners, based a little bit on his really weird and very unsuccessful peace negotiation at Niagara Falls with Confederate commissioners. But Greeley spends a bit of that campaign, and his supporters have to say like, no, he doesn't want to compensate former slave owners. But on the other hand, like, that could appeal to white Southern voters. So maybe he doesn't want to say that he wouldn't do that. I think that where we see this playing out then by the middle to late 1870s into the 1880s is that's when you start to see politicians step away from this claim of compensation. And I think there's a lot going on there, and I'm going to try not to dive down a rabbit hole because I was literally reading and writing about this right before we started recording. But I think what's going on is it's a large part of the kind of Southern political realignment that we see bringing on the end of Reconstruction, and the call for compensation and even debt relief becomes less and less politically valuable, but where it does resurface particularly then is in this construction of white Americans' memory of the Civil War, right? So in particular, former Confederate leaders and kind of lost cause writers are constantly, from like about 1880 through 1900, trying to figure out whether or not Abraham Lincoln would have compensated former slave owners at the Hampton Roads Peace Conference in February of 1865. And they essentially, their conversation is really doing two different things. One, it's kind of playing into that memory of Abraham Lincoln as, and this is another Dunning School tenet of that Abraham Lincoln would have been like the more lenient reconstructor as opposed to Congress. So they're trying to say like Lincoln would have done it. Lincoln totally would have done it. But the other really important reason why they're trying to prove that Lincoln offered white Southerners compensation in 1865, as late as 1865, right, is that they're basically saying, well, if Lincoln offered Confederates compensation and they didn't take it, that meant the war wasn't about slavery because they didn't take compensation for surrender. Which, which is just, it's very, as historians would love to say, like teleological logic, right? Like you can only make that argument if you know what happened and what would happen in April of 1865. So I think that debate amongst these former Confederates is what will really feed into the Dunning School arguments, right? Because they're really trying to like rehash and write for themselves this history of compensation that actually has them denying it simply because, as they said, slavery wasn't important. And Abraham Lincoln was very nice.
So, so looking at your work, and it is in some ways, it's still surprising to me how little this question has been covered. How does it kind of change your thinking about kind of historiography of period, and also like how, why now? Why is, what does it mean for us, right? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to do my best to not give you convoluted thoughts on that. I think that, I guess in some ways, I might think about it the way that my my early graduate student self would have thought about it, which is, well, of course they did. Like, of course they wanted compensation. Like, of course the Dunning School denied that they had compensation. Like that would have been very much my like knee jerk, my reaction in my early 20s, I guess. Like, I think though, one reason why now is simply that it's not that historians since the Dunning School, like since 1900, haven't thought about these issues. It's just that it takes that long to chip away at this historiography, and not just because it's years of historiography, but because that was such politically motivated historiography, right? It was created for a very singular purpose, and written into politics, right? It wasn't just historians saying it. It was a part
of the last talk, it seems, because it's
so. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, it does seem like it's a fundamental component of lost cause, the myth making of postbellum, the postbellum South. I mean, as you said, the argument that it wasn't about slavery is that this, I mean, the question of compensation kind of that around. It almost has to be
right. And I think then there's a few other aspects. Is one, I've benefited from quite a few years of Black scholars and activists coming into the academy and putting more and more attention on slavery as a capitalist system, right? Like historians have now done the work of saying like, slavery is profitable. Not only is it profitable, but it undergirded this legal and financial system that affected the entire U.S. and not just the South. So once you start from that assumption, right, like then you can ask, well, what did they expect? What did these white Southerners expect when they were still buying and selling? enslaved people in 1865. And I think also, like, to your earlier question about the connection between like calls for land distribution at the end of the war and compensation, right? Like, it's interesting to me. I think where the connection lies the most, right, is that the white Southerners who are claiming compensation for former slave owners are saying very similar things to what proponents of reparations today would say. They are stressing the centrality of slavery to their economy, their politics, their worldview, right? And so I think that very much dovetails with what, like, the 1619 Project says about that same centrality of slavery to the U.S. And my project, as well as those projects, are asking questions like, well, who's going to bear that financial burden?
Right.
The Americans I'm studying were asking themselves, who's going to bear the financial burden of emancipation? And I'm hoping to show how that turns into a conversation about how are white Americans going to grapple with the history of like generations of enslavement and wealth that came from it. And of course, I end up showing how white Americans largely decide that they won't deal with that question, really. But they at least do in the short term, right? With that section of the 14th Amendment. What for sure is not happening is that white Southerners will not be compensated for the war and emancipation and enslavement.
It's really been, I'm so sorry that we haven't been able to be in the office because of the coronavirus, but it's been wonderful the short time that you were with us. Really fascinating work, and it's been great having you in New Haven. During better times you'll return. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. I'm glad that we managed to do this in a creative way in the midst of everything. And yeah, I hope everyone is safe and healthy.
Slavery and Its Legacies is brought to you by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, a part of the Whitney and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University. Additional support is provided by the Rabina Foundation, and production support is provided by the Yale Broadcast Center. For more information about the Gilder Lehrman Center, its activities, and this podcast, visit glc.yale.edu.